Putin says the West is imposing gender diversity and other perversions on Russia. And now the Russian government is beginning to mobilize homophobia in order to distract public attention from its failures in the war.
Если западные элиты полагают, что смогут внедрить в сознание своих людей, своих обществ, странноватые, на мой взгляд, но новомодные тенденции вроде десятков гендеров и гей-парадов, так тому и быть. Да пускай делают, что хотят. Но на что они точно не имеют права, так это требовать от других следовать в том же направлении.
Russia's propaganda targets have changed with the flow of combat. First, they came to fight the Nazis in Ukraine. Then, Russia started losing badly, and the new target was NATO biolabs with weaponized mosquitoes.
Остается без ответа вопрос о патенте США номер...
There's still an unanswered question about US patent number 8967029BU1, dated March 3, 2015, where a trademark was issued for an unmanned aerial vehicle for the dissemination of infected mosquitoes. That is, equipment that is intended as a technical apparatus for the delivery and use of biological weapons, biological agents, bacteria, and viruses, including highly contingent variants that could, quote, eliminate all enemy personnel.
It may sound ridiculous, because it certainly is, but in the fertile soil of Russian state TV, the seeds of a crazy conspiracy theory can grow into a jungle of emotion and fears. Now, after Putin has begun to lose his credibility in the wake of so many strategic failures, the propaganda targets have shifted once again. Russia's greatest enemies are now Western Satanists who wrap themselves in the rainbow flag.
Разве мы хотим, чтобы у нас здесь, в нашей стране, в России, вместо мамы и папы был родитель номер 1, номер 2, номер 3? Совсем спятили уже-то. Разве мы хотим, чтобы в наших школах с начальных классов детям навязывали извращения, которые ведут к деградации и вымиранию? Чтобы им вдалбливали, что кроме женщины и мужчины якобы существуют еще некие гендеры.
The Kremlin's newest propaganda target is now the LGBT community, normal human beings whose sexuality does not conform to a standard binary pair. But to avoid sounding like uneducated bigots, the Kremlin says it is only protecting children from so-called LGBT propaganda, and has even set its sights on the American sitcom Friends for its positive portrayal of fictional gay characters.
Нужно было иметь очень хорошее зрение, чтобы заметить.
You would have to have a very keen eye to notice that in the show Friends, which first came out in 1994, the first episode begins with the main character coming in, looking depressed and lonely because his wife had left him for a woman. And all of this is shown rather sympathetically. Good for her, the show says, and sucks for him. That was 1994. Noticing clear, brazen propaganda in this was almost impossible because it was so new and so radical.
In the last week of October, the Russian Duma unanimously approved legislation aimed at what they call preventing the propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations. Duma Speaker Vyacheslav Volodin introduced the law, and more than 300 deputies from all coalition parties signed on as co-authors. There were no votes against.
We have to return our government ideology to the Constitution. Otherwise, we will be doomed to the sexual minorities dominating politics, just like what has already happened in the West.
The propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships is war. It's a spiritual war, a war of information, an ideological war.
In this latest distraction from Putin's war in Ukraine, the exaggerated fears of Western pro-LGBT propaganda are so strong that hateful Russian anti-LGBT propaganda has begun circulating on state TV. And why not? In April, state broadcasters said they found gay materials for kids in a destroyed Mariupol bomb shelter that they said was funded by the US government.
Words can't describe what we're finding here. It's an attack on children, on the most vulnerable people in society. One house that we found back from when it was still Ukraine and they had NATO bases there, used to be the headquarters of an organization of non-traditional sexual orientations, gays, lesbians, and everything else. It was directly funded by the American independent agency USAID. The House had a sign saying exactly that. If you look at the history of this organization, then you can see it is essentially directly sponsored by the US President and Congress.
But now the propaganda is personal, and the attacks on individuals and institutions are increasing. This week, Russia's top propagandist Vladimir Solovyov set the tone with hateful insults and slurs that he broadcast live on air.
Вообще что-то происходит со всеми этими либеральными звездами. У кого-то, конечно, полное счастье, а у кого-то, кажется, полное несчастье. Вот, например, был такой Зыгорь, который, конечно, не просто гей, а просто конченый, да, гей. И вот теперь у него такое счастье в жизни, и он не может его не выложить, не поделиться. Это прям так трогательно.
Mikhail Zygar, our colleague and the former editor-in-chief of TV Rain, married his husband, Jean-Michel Sherbak, in Portugal last week, and is now a target for anti-gay hate on state TV by Solovyov, Russia's propaganda king.
И вот эти два счастливых гея, при этом, яху, у них такая радость, вот, конечно, полку прибыло, яху, это же просто такое счастье. И Зыгорь, он такой счастливый, он так об этом написал, что это вообще это надо понимать. Он, правда, не знает, как теперь правильно это все называть. То есть он не знает, как вот эту всю мразь, мерзость, всю эту тлетворность и гадость, как ее назвать. И вот он у себя пишет: «Мы поженились». Наверное, правильно говорить: вышли замуж. Любовь, свобода, правда, счастье. Пора начинать освобождение самих себя. А в каких кандалах вы находились?
The truth is that gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people in Russia, human beings with feelings and emotions and the same need for human love as everyone else, are a useful tool for Putin and his propagandists. Instead of respecting their human rights, the Kremlin turns the LGBT community into an object of categorical hate by an irrational fear called homophobia, reinforced by basic human ignorance and stupidity. And this homophobia is a pathway to more drastic measures that are being used to incite the Russian people further into a war the Kremlin now says is against the forces of darkness and evil.
А теперь вся страна должна встать на войну. И стиснув зубы, потому что воюем не с этой бандеровской сволочью и педиками в его управлении, а воюем со всей сатанинской машиной Запада.
And now we're joined by Russian journalist Stanislav Kucher. Stanislav, welcome. Thanks for joining me here.
Hi, Tihan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right, so even by official polling, we can see that the support for Putin is falling. Is this anti-LGBT propaganda just another attempt to change his popular standing?
Well, I'm pretty positive that you know and I know that one of the main problems of today's Russia is the absence of any coherent ideology, right? Every time we hear from Putin or his propaganda peddlers something like, we must not allow the West to destroy the soulless West, to destroy our system, our genetic code, and our values, we realize this is complete nonsense, because it's worth remembering that Kremlin does not have any structured ideology, any structured mindset, and we don't expect them to have that. They have nothing to do except trying to oppose like they, us, Putin, vs the rest of the world. And so they try to search, find, exaggerate, and oppose certain what they believe are ideological points. And basically, these are old, dusty postulates from their dense past, partly Soviet, partly criminal. And one of these points is the attitude to the very idea, to the very topic of LGBTQ. And I'm absolutely sure that, for example, if in today's Europe and the United States were publicly and openly homophobic, then Putin's Russia would be at the front line of the LGBTQ rights movement. And since Europe and the States are openly, well, they openly stand for human rights and tolerance, so the Kremlin saddled the theme of rejection of both human rights and the rights of LGBTQ. And moreover, I would say that this rhetoric perfectly fits into both the Soviet cultural and psychological tradition and the criminal one. And so, yes, the guys in the State Duma, in the Russian parliament, they strongly believe that every time they come up with something against LGBTQ, that will definitely be supported by that, what I call silently obedient majority of Russians who support whatever Putin is doing. But another thing is that right now we're not talking about repressions. I mean, we don't witness any repressions at this point. And I'd like to stress that it's only at this point. I emphasize for now, okay? While we're talking about the legitimization of prosecution for propaganda, the dissemination of content that, according to Putin's legislators, popularizes the topic of LGBTQ. That is, so far, again, at this point, there are no repressions directed against LGBTQ representatives, at least not in the bills that we see, which are right now under consideration or have passed the first reading in the State Duma. And according to what we see, again, according to all those initiatives, it will be possible to persecute, for example, you, Tikhon, or me, if we come up with the idea of launching a series with main characters that are gay on Dost or, for example, on my YouTube channel or elsewhere. So that's where we are now. But that does not mean that repressions are anywhere not near, because they are pretty close. And it's only one step to real repressions from where we are now.
But this rhetoric, this anti-LGBT rhetoric, how effectively could this work in his favor, in Putin's favor? I mean, in your opinion, is Russian society actually homophobic, or it's just a stereotype which is being used by the Russian government?
Well, I mean, here you, Tikhon, and I, again, have we can draw conclusions from our personal experience, right? From talking with different people and representatives of what we would call the Russian society. And let's say I was born and brought up in the Soviet Union. I was 19 when the Soviet Union broke up, right? So right now we see that the older generation of Russians, let's say 45 plus or 50 plus, they are more homophobic than the younger generation of Russians, okay, who already have been brought in the early zeros or in the 90s with the idea that, yeah, okay, LGBTQ are fine and just are as rightful members of our society as anybody else. So I would say that I don't think this will work, especially not now. I mean, again, I don't even believe that the initiatives the parliamentarians, the so-called parliamentarians, have come up with has anything to do with the attempt to boost Vladimir Putin's popularity. I don't think they themselves had that in mind. What they had in mind is just come up with something else, something that would, in their opinion, make them look as the defenders of the so-called traditional values. Why? Again, because they have nothing else to offer to the Russian public. They have no ideology whatsoever. And unfortunately, or fortunately, they just don't have, they don't have the brains, they don't have the intellectual capacity to come up with something really structured and something new. You know this famous expression that every century has their own dark ages. So ever since, I guess, at least ever since Putin's, third term in 2012, Russia's entered its dark ages and have been coming up with one weird anti-human initiative after another. So again, there is nothing new about this, and I don't think this will work for Putin's popularity. Honestly, judging from what I see and hear from my friends, acquaintances in Russia, judging from what I read on Russian social media, I can't think of anything that can raise Putin's popularity at this point. It's diminishing rapidly, and this is the process that can hardly be stopped.
You've been living in the United States for the last couple of years, several years. Do you see any...
3.5 years.
Yeah. Do you see any similarities between the way Russian authorities and American conservatives or the representatives of the Republican Party use anti-LGBT issues to their own political gain? For example, build on this reality about us and they?
Well, again, trying to divide, to rule and divide is a pretty old tradition, as we both know, right? And of course, you can find similarities between what Putin and his coterie are doing right now and with what hardline Republicans or Trump supporters have been doing in the past. You can find those similarities, but I would not really emphasize them to the point where we can say that they're doing exactly the same thing. No, they're not. And again, here we come to a question of whether the Russian society is homophobic or not. And we can address the American society with a similar question. Is it homophobic or not? You will always find a certain number of homophobes in America and in Russia. How popular their ideas are depends on what the society and the government is doing about it. I mean, if the government and the society support those ideas openly, then those guys become the mainstream. If not, they don't. And so in the States, no matter what the rhetoric of Trump or some of hardline conservatives in the US can be, I don't see any reason how it can possibly become something of a mainstream in this country, whereas it definitely a part of the mainstream ideology in Russia.
All right. Thank you so much, Stanislav Kucher. Thanks for joining me here on Russia Tomorrow.